Welcome to the National Science Foundation Center for Breeding Indigenous Knowledge in Science, or CBIKS Higher Education Research Policy Collaboratories Tribal Consultation and Academic Researchers Informational Module. This module is designed to give academic researchers foundational knowledge about the way that tribal sovereignty shapes research practices with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities in academia. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the deep time relationships that exist between the landscape that my institution sits upon and the indigenous peoples in this area. Northern Arizona University sits at the base of the San Francisco Peaks on homeland sacred to Native Americans throughout the region. We honor their past, present, and future generations who have lived here for millennia and will forever call this place home. Yat she Dr. Merrick Martinez inishe. Tit ane nishle, do ni mi puli paktise bashashin, ado kis ani edashache do belagane edashnele, akut ego sane nishle. Hello, I am Dr. Merrick Martinez, and I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation and a descendant of both the Nez Perce and Hopi tribes. I'm a co-PI of CBIKS, where I support the broader impacts team. I lead the Transforming Science Higher Ed Policy Collaboratory, and I'm a co-lead of the Southwestern Hub at Northern Arizona University. At NAU, I'm an associate professor in the anthropology department. The NSF CBIKS Higher Education Research Policy Collaboratory is part of the Transforming Science Collaboratories. This collab is centered on three main goals: learning from the regional hub's research experiences to support research, serving the hubs through direct and indirect support and capacity building, and supporting the broader CBIKS network, operation, and research activities. In learning from the various parts of CBIKS, I will work with the other collab leads to produce information such as curricula, training sessions and workshops, policy briefs, and template policies to support the implementation of tribal consultation policy within higher educational institutions, among the other Transforming Science COLI research goals. Our focus is twofold: developing a robust understanding of the processes, methods, and protocols of braiding knowledges using the Indigenous Research Circle framework pictured below, and exploring best practices for community-based participatory research with Indigenous communities. As part of my research goals, I am focusing on developing manuscripts to guide researchers in developing research relationships with Native and Indigenous nations in ethical and culturally grounded ways, while respecting and understanding tribal sovereignty. I am also working to provide information to the general public about research processes and guidance on navigating research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities. I should also note that this learning module focuses specifically on the U.S. and its federal trust responsibilities with Native Americans in recognition of the place-based research and focus. We use Native and Indigenous nations and communities to recognize the diverse communities throughout the U.S. that have such relationships with the federal government. Throughout this learning module, we will focus on tribal sovereignty, what tribal consultation is, and what constitutes meaningful consultation, as well as providing some grounding questions for researchers who are new to research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities. We will end with some wise practices and sharing resources for additional learning opportunities. As we begin our journey on learning about the legal and policy authorities and background of tribal consultation, we need to start at the foundation of what we in the United States of America have termed federal Indian policy, which guides and mandates formal and documented consultation with elected leadership and federal agency leadership. This policy is rooted in the U.S. Constitution, specifically the Open Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. This phrase establishes federal authority over Indian affairs, often interpreted as plenary power, and places tribes under federal jurisdiction. This clause remains a cornerstone of federal Indian policy. Within this nation-to-nation relationship, tribal nations are considered domestic, dependent nations that operate their own governments, laws, and policy. So what does tribal sovereignty have to do with academic researchers, you might be asking yourself? Well, this means that as a representative of a higher educational institution, you have a responsibility to engage with and request permission to conduct research on tribal lands with tribal citizens or when utilizing tribally owned and held ancestors, genetic material, and/or other quote-unquote resources, or if your research has implications on a specific tribal nation as named in your research. These research actions require obtaining research permits or approvals from impacted tribal nations. There are several laws and policies that mandate research reviews from tribal nations, including all federal agencies whom have a responsibility to seek out impacted resources, lands, or peoples, identify impacted nations and communities, document efforts to name impacts to affected nations and communities, and the resulting meetings and agreements. If these impacts are within the exterior boundaries of the nation's homelands, such as reservations, these meetings are quite different, as the nations make the final decision of action to mitigate impacts. Tribal sovereignty is the inherent right of Native nations in the USA to self-govern, define citizenship, make and enforce laws on homelands for the care and protection of resources, and regulate property use. This sovereignty is a right secured through treaty negotiations with the U.S. government. Although the U.S. government signed over 370 treaties with Native Americans throughout the treaty-making period, guaranteeing sovereignty over homelands and citizens. In the 1830s, the unique sovereign status of Native Americans was affirmed through 3 court cases known as the Marshall Trilogy, based on a ruling of Chief Justice John Marshall. These 3 cases secured Native American rights to sovereign rule as domestic dependent nations over their lands, over their citizens, and a unique status that ensured the federal government's nation-to-nation relationship, and thereby the federal trust responsibility towards Native Americans that at the time resembled a guardian-ward relationship. Over time, and over several court cases, Native American nations now enjoy the ability to assert their sovereign status and the right to decide and implement tribal codes or laws that have jurisdiction within the exterior boundaries of their homelands, and that ensure all activities, including research, support the well-being of their citizens. This is especially important to remember, as the way that Native and Indigenous nations and communities have defined research is different than institutional definitions of research, which creates some interesting dynamics and applications to higher ed institutional review boards versus Indigenous institutional review boards. Deciding and implementing research ethics, practices, and benefits of the research should be conducted in discussion with Indigenous representatives and our communities before any applications are submitted. In braiding methodologies, this is where the third strand of a co-creative and co-productive research space is created to determine what these are together as partners in the research. This is where some of the novel research ideas spring from. As a wise practice, researchers should plan to include the ways that research benefits the well-being and the best interests of Indigenous nations, communities, and citizens, as they apply to both higher ed and Indigenous IRBs, offices, or leadership, as identified and agreed upon with Indigenous representatives in the research. Tribal consultation is a legal requirement of some federal regulations that recognizes tribal sovereignty by requiring agencies and contractors receiving federal funding or being issued federal permits for research to engage in meaningful consultation and dialogue with tribal leadership before making policies, decisions, or regulations that may impact tribal rights, lands, and/or resources. However, there is no mandate that requires approval per se from tribal nations in the regulations, just that tribal nations are hopefully engaged in meaningful consultation and dialogue about the project and its impact to tribal rights, lands, and/or resources. Tribal consultation is different than public comment in federal undertakings and is based in tribal sovereignty and their federal trust homelands. Native nations are considered consulted and interested parties, not the general public, and are afforded the opportunity to share concerns and potential mitigation strategies to minimize adverse impacts on lands, citizens, and/or resources as part of the considered pathways moving forward with the undertaking or activity. To reiterate, there is not necessarily an approval needed during federal tribal consultation. Rather, once federal agencies have demonstrated they sent information to Native American leadership and said leadership did not respond within 30 to 45 days, the agency is able to move forward without input from Native American leadership. However, with research efforts and academic researchers, most Native American nations have tribal codes or regulations that not only define what research is within their laws, but that also govern all research on tribal homelands, research on with or by tribal citizens, research on with or by tribally managed resources, and a research that utilizes tribal names or that may have potential impacts to the nation as a whole. All these activities are reviewed, managed, and approved or denied by the nation, whether through official independent institutional review boards, tribal historic preservation offices, cultural review boards, or through tribal leadership. In the Common Rule, we see considerations for individual consent versus collective consent, where an informed consent is viewed as individual decision. In viewing this through a tribal sovereignty lens, if the individual is a citizen living on tribal lands, the tribal nation has jurisdiction to ensure that the individual's and the collective tribal nation's rights are protected under a review by the tribal nation's governing body, whether through an IRB, a department, or tribal leadership review and approval. However, in the case the research is occurring off tribal lands, it is the researcher's responsibility to ensure that their research activities do not have implications to a specific named tribe, as many tribal nations have rights to their individual tribal names. Each nation has their own priorities, needs, concerns, and relationships that guide and influence research that is approved or denied. Research without this official approval is unlawful and has the potential to destroy relationships between tribal nations and higher ed institutions. Therefore, it is critical that higher ed institutions ensure compliance with tribal research codes when approving research with, by, and for Native nations from institutional researchers, or those decisions can have long-lasting implications to research with and by Native nations. Approvals for research from Native and Indigenous nations and communities varies and depends upon the tribal codes, research infrastructure, and capacity of research review boards, offices, or individuals. Nevertheless, as a researcher conducting research on tribal lands with tribal citizens residing on tribal lands or utilizing tribal resources or specific names, it is your responsibility to collect some documentation of approval or support from appropriate tribal representatives. Sometimes this is an email, sometimes this is an official letter, and sometimes it's an official research permit. A wise practice is that formal tribal consultation provides an opportunity for meaningful consultation with Native and Indigenous nations and communities through Baiting methodologies, third strand space, that supports early, two-way, and sustained dialogue that shows a respect for sovereignty, especially when securing tribal research permits. The foundation of meaningful consultation indicates there is a prior relationship with Native nations. Institutional researchers move beyond official notification of intended research actions, and that Native nations have the opportunity to co-design and co-create research alongside institutional researchers. Researchers should be keen to avoid extractive research practices and focus on research that is collaborative, culturally grounded, and braided with Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and creating research products that are mutually beneficial to the researcher and the community. Many institutional researchers have not had formal training in how to work with and by Native nations in research, and in some cases, institutional researchers have no understanding of the ways that tribal sovereignty shapes and guides research with and by Native nations. In these cases, it is important to note that each Native nation is different in the ways that they have defined research, the ways that they review and approve or deny research, and how research is disseminated. Researchers are often confounded by understanding which tribal nations need to be consulted for research activities, and even further, which offices or leadership should be contacted for research conversations. Understanding when consultation and submission of research proposals is needed, and how to request and document official approval for research with and by Native nations. As institutional researchers, we also have to remember that every Native nation in the U.S. and beyond will have different processes and steps to complete research with and by their constituencies, on their homelands, and or on their resources, and it is our responsibility to ensure we have obtained official and proper approval to conduct research with and by Native nations. A wise practice is that tribal sovereignty governs research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities. This guides research design creation and focuses on community benefits before researcher benefits. And Indigenous data sovereignty is a critical and deciding research consideration for these communities. Now that we have visited what tribal consultation looks like, what activities initiate research review processes, and what meaningful consultation looks like, I'd like to ask a few questions to gauge your level of understanding of research review processes with and by Native nations. If you are not sure about some of the answers, I encourage you to speak to your institutional leadership and ask some of these questions as a way to understand the nature of your relationships with Native and Indigenous nations and communities. Additionally, this information will assist in establishing foundational research relationships if these relationships don't already exist. Question 1. Does your institution have any relationships with Native and Indigenous nations and communities? What do these relationships look like? Is there support to bring knowledge holders and or leadership to campus, or has institutional leadership visited these homelands? Question 2. How does your institution provide support and or capacity building for Native and Indigenous nations and community partners? Is there reciprocal capacity building between these communities and your institution? Has this kind of reciprocal support been extended to these communities? Is your institution a land grant institution? If yes, this relationship is even more critical. Question 3. Does your institution have a tribal consultation policy or guidance for researchers to conduct research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities? Does your institution have any training resources or support to teach researchers about research with and by these communities? These three wise practices can be useful guideposts in supporting and engaging in research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities. Taking a tribal sovereignty lens in preparing for research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities means that the well-being and best interests of your partners is critical, and that formal tribal consultation provides research with the opportunity to engage in meaningful research partnerships with and by these communities, and most times increases the potential for future research projects. As part of these three wise practices, we need to remember that work with Indigenous research partners before the research is finalized is critical. Braiding supports co-creative research that is mutually beneficial. Following braiding methodologies, utilizing the third space to establish ethical and culturally grounded research relationships is critical in relational research. Tribal sovereignty governs research with and by Native and Indigenous nations and communities. If you are interested in reading more about higher education research policy and practices, check out our Zotero library and our CBIKS Higher Ed Policy Collab YouTube channel. Both the short bit.ly link and the QR code are available for you here. Ahiaha katsiaoyao, and thank you for your time and consideration. We hope that you've learned a lot in your journey with us. If you have any questions, please direct them to cbixhighered@gmail.com and we'll respond as soon as possible. Thank you again.